He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king. Tall, calm, carefully dressed, a long gray beard resting on his chest. People bowed when he entered the room. They called him civilized, modern, even generous. But far away, thousands of miles from his palace, people had never heard his name. They only heard the boots. They only saw the guns. They only felt the silence after the shouting stopped. He never visited their villages. He never saw their homes burn. He never watched the lines of men disappear into the forest. And yet, everything that happened in his name. This wasn't a war. There were no battlefields, no marching armies, no victory speeches. Just orders, numbers, and a growing demand for something the world suddenly needed. Rubber. A king in Europe, a jungle in Africa, and a distance so large it hid everything. At home, he built monuments, grand buildings, parks, statues. People admired him. They said he was building the future. But somewhere else, the cost was being counted differently. Not in money, not in land, in lives. Millions, some would later say. Maybe more, maybe less. No one knows for sure. And that uncertainty still hangs in the air. Because history remembers conquerors, history remembers tyrants. But this man owned a country privately, and almost no one talked about it. So the question lingers. Was he just another king? Or something far worse? He wanted to be remembered. That was the problem. Not feared, not loved, remembered. He watched the great empires of Europe. Britain had oceans. France had continents. Even small kingdoms had flags planted far away. But he had Belgium, a small country, quiet, careful, easy to overlook. People didn't expect much from him. They smiled politely, they listened, and they moved on. He noticed that. He always noticed that. Inside royal meetings, he spoke about expansion, about opportunity, about greatness. The room stayed calm. No one argued, no one laughed. They simply didn't take him seriously. He was a king without an empire. And for a man like him, that felt like failure. He studied maps at night, long after the palace went quiet, his finger drifting across empty spaces. Not Europe. Too crowded, too political. He looked farther, toward places most leaders barely discussed. Africa. To many Europeans, it was just a blank, a distant shape, a place of rumors and rivers. To him, it looked like possibility. Not a colony, not a partnership. Something more personal. He didn't talk about conquest. He talked about civilization, about trade, about helping the world grow. It sounded noble, measured, harmless. That made it easier to ignore. But ambition rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, quiet, patient. And sometimes the most dangerous plans begin when no one is paying attention. He wasn't powerful enough to take an empire, not by force. So he started thinking differently. If he couldn't rule through war, could he rule through persuasion? If he couldn't conquer land, could he simply be given one? That idea stayed with him, quietly, growing, because the world saw a minor king. But he saw something else, a chance to own not just land, but a country, alone. He kept returning to the map, night after night. His finger never rushed. It wandered, paused, then settled over one place. A vast green space, barely defined, mostly unknown. To many Europeans it looked empty. To him, it looked available. He imagined rivers no one controlled, forests no army guarded, villages far from any flag. Distance felt like permission. He didn't see borders. He saw silence. And silence meant opportunity. The Congo Basin stretched endlessly. Thick jungle, heavy air, waterways twisting through the land. It wasn't easy to reach. That made it perfect. No strong European power had claimed it. No empire had drawn firm lines. It existed in between. He began talking about it carefully, not as a prize, not as territory, as a mission. He spoke of ending slavery, of bringing order, of opening trade routes. The words sounded gentle, measured, responsible. People nodded. Some even admired the idea. A king trying to help a distant land. It felt modern. But he wasn't imagining schools or hospitals or shared prosperity. He was imagining ownership. Not Belgium's, his. A private land, answering only to him. That idea was unusual, even for kings. Countries were ruled. Empires were governed. But owned? That blurred something deeper. He leaned closer to the map, the room quiet, the candle burning low. Africa no longer looked distant. It looked personal. A place large enough to change his legacy, remote enough to avoid attention, and quiet enough to shape without resistance. The land didn't know his name. The people didn't know his plans. But the decision was already forming. Because sometimes the most dangerous ambitions begin with a simple thought. What if no one stops me? He didn't send soldiers first. He sent words. Soft ones, careful ones, the kind that make people lower their guard. He spoke about humanity, about ending slavery, about bringing light to a place the world barely understood. It sounded generous. It sounded modern. It sounded safe. He invited explorers, missionaries, scholars, men who believed they were helping, men who believed they were witnessing history. He funded expeditions into the Congo. Boats moved up the rivers. Flags appeared quietly along the banks. Not military flags, association flags, scientific flags, humanitarian flags. It didn't look like conquest. That was the point. Back in Europe, he held meetings, polite conversations, formal dinners. He spoke calmly, measured tone, no urgency. Just concern for the people of Africa. Some leaders were skeptical. Most were distracted. Europe was busy. Borders shifting, empires competing. A small king asking for influence in a distant jungle didn't feel threatening. So they listened, they nodded, they signed papers. Agreements built slowly, quietly, piece by piece. No one moment felt dangerous. No single decision felt irreversible. That's what made it work. He created an organization, not an empire, not a colony, an association. It sounded neutral, almost charitable. He promised free trade, open access, shared benefit. The language felt fair, balanced, responsible. But the structure said something else. Control flowed upward, authority narrowed, and at the top, only one name. The land wasn't Belgian. It wasn't European. It was his. Privately ruled, personally directed, quietly approved. The world called it progress. He called it success. And the people living there weren't asked. No vote, no negotiation, no warning. A country changed hands without ever knowing it. The lie wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in speeches, in signatures, in polite applause. By the time anyone looked closer, it already existed. A king, a distant land, and a promise that sounded noble. But behind that promise sat something colder. Because when power hides inside good intentions, it becomes harder to see. And when no one sees it, it grows. So the question lingers. Did the world believe him? Or did they simply want to? He didn't change his tone. He didn't raise his voice. From Europe, everything still sounded noble. Progress, trade, civilization. But in the Congo, the message arrived differently. Men in uniform carried it, boots in the mud, rifles resting on shoulders. They didn't bring speeches, they brought orders. Villages were gathered, names were counted, expectations explained. Each community owed something now, not loyalty, not taxes. Rubber. The demand sounded simple. Collect sap from the vines, fill the baskets, meet the quota. But the forest wasn't gentle. The vines were deep inside, hours away, days sometimes. Men walked farther each time, leaving families behind, returning tired, sometimes empty-handed. The numbers didn't change, the quotas stayed the same. And when the baskets came back light, the silence broke. Punishments followed, quick, public. A warning first, then something harsher. Hostages taken, villages watched, fear settling like fog. The soldiers didn't shout much. They didn't need to. Everyone understood the rhythm. Rubber, or consequences. The jungle changed. Paths became longer. Time became dangerous. Men stopped hunting, stopped farming, stopped sleeping. Everything bent toward one task. Collect more, move faster. Don't return empty. Back in Europe, reports spoke of productivity, of growth, of success. Numbers improved. Profits climbed. The distance held. It hid the strain. No one heard the footsteps at night. No one saw the villages thinning. No one counted the missing. The system didn't look violent on paper. It looked efficient. But pressure kept tightening, quotas rising, patience shrinking. And when fear becomes routine, it stops looking like fear. It starts looking like order. A king far away, a demand that never softened, a forest forced to answer. The lie had worked. Now the cost began. Because once a land becomes property, the people inside it can start to look like numbers. And when people become numbers, what happens when the numbers fall short? He wasn't there. That mattered. Distance made everything quieter, cleaner, easier to explain. Orders traveled down rivers, through officers, through checkpoints. By the time they reached the villages, they had hardened. Soldiers were given ammunition, limited, counted. Each bullet meant something. Each shot had to be justified. So proof was demanded. Not stories, not reports. Proof. The rules sounded administrative, practical, efficient. But on the ground, it changed behavior. A man fired a rifle. Someone fell. And suddenly, that wasn't enough. They needed something to carry back. Something small. Something undeniable. Hands. At first, it was explained as control, a way to prevent wasted bullets, a way to track discipline. But systems like this don't stay contained. Fear spreads faster than rules. Villages heard rumors, then saw evidence, then understood. The forest no longer felt like escape. It felt like a trap. Men ran deeper into the jungle. Some never came back. Others stayed, working faster, silently. Mothers watched paths disappear. Children learned not to ask questions. The pressure kept rising. Quotas didn't slow. Expectations didn't soften. And proof kept moving upward. From outposts to stations to reports. On paper, it looked like discipline, control, efficiency. But the reality left marks no report could hold. Even some officers grew uneasy. Missionaries wrote letters. Witnesses described what they saw. At first, the world didn't listen. The distance still worked. But stories have weight. And sometimes they travel. Photographs appeared. Testimonies spread. Questions followed. People far away began to see pieces. Not everything, but enough. Enough to feel something was wrong. A king had asked for rubber. A system demanded proof. And somewhere in between, human life became negotiable. He never gave the order in person. He never held the rifle. He never walked those paths. But the structure led there, step by step, quietly. And once it started, it didn't stop easily. Because when fear becomes currency, people pay whatever they have. So the question lingered. Was this cruelty? or just the system working exactly as designed. He didn't expect the photos to travel. The man holding them thought they might. He unfolded them slowly. Small prints, hands missing, eyes staring past the camera. He showed them to a friend first, then another, then a room. The room went quiet. People leaned closer, not out of curiosity, out of disbelief. They asked the same question. What happened here? The answer didn't sound like a war, didn't sound like a rebellion, didn't sound like chaos. It sounded organized. Reports followed the photos, letters, names, dates. Missionaries wrote at night. Traders whispered at docks. Clerks copied numbers they couldn't forget. The story started forming, slow, uneven, hard to ignore. Across the ocean, people read it over breakfast. Some folded the paper, some read it twice. It didn't fit the image they were given, not the speeches, not the promises, not the civilizing mission. The discomfort spread quietly, like something sour left too long. Writers picked it up, activists passed pamphlets, meetings filled with uneasy faces. They weren't in the jungle, but they could see the hands. Governments hesitated. Questions began anyway, polite at first, then sharper. How many? Who ordered this? Who benefits? The distance was still there, but it felt smaller now. Because once people see something, they start looking again. And once the world starts looking, silence becomes harder to keep. A king still far away, a system still running. But the shadows were beginning to move. So what happens when a secret stops being secret? He watched from a distance, the world stirring beneath him. Letters, reports, photos spreading quietly. He didn't panic. He didn't act rashly. He smiled, softly, almost as if nothing mattered. The empire he built was personal, not public. He negotiated quietly, transferred control, claimed success. But not accountability, not responsibility. People celebrated treaties. He collected titles. The Congo changed hands. He walked away. The jungle remained. The echoes remained. Some called it justice. Some called it luck. But the hands, the lives, the fear remained. He never returned. He never looked back. And history was left to decide. What does it mean when a king walks away and the cost stays behind?